Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to the organizers and the hosts of this event for inviting me to speak and to share on this topic. So I'm excited to share with you some of the research that I did as part of my doctorate at the Douglas Hospital Research Institute. And so the title of my talk for today is Identifying Mental Health Predictors of Risky Driving Among First-Time Driving While Impaired Offenders. So this will hopefully provide you with a bit of an example of how machine learning can be implemented in clinical research and in a field that is related to mental health and public health as well. And so what I would love is for if you could just keep an eye out for opportunities as I'm presenting, keep an eye out for any opportunities where you could see potential for application and also red flags. There are a lot of those too. So I'm going to highlight them at the end, but keep an eye out for those. So road traffic crashes contribute to 1.35 million fatalities each year around the world and are the leading cause of death in ages 5 to 29. Beyond this direct impact, when victims are injured or killed, it also impacts the mental and financial well-being of their families, communities, and workplaces. So much so that health economists estimate road traffic crashes are responsible for between $1 and $8 trillion US in annual costs worldwide by the time we factor in things like workplace productivity and healthcare costs. Now, 94% of road traffic crashes are due to risky driving. Of that 94%, over a fifth of driver deaths involve alcohol over the legal limit of 0.08% BAC, and that leaves another 77.4% that are attributable to other types of risky driving behaviors like excess swerving, speeding, or running red lights. While we know that male drivers are more likely to be responsible for crash fatalities, researchers still haven't been able to clearly isolate what other factors are contributing to risky driving. Males with a first-time conviction of driving while impaired, or DWI, represent a key at-risk population for engaging in risky driving. And they also present us with a great opportunity for prevention since, unlike the general population, we have records of who these people actually are. So we can apply various interventions at various parts of the relicensing process. And this allows them to receive the appropriate help while also keeping our roads safe. So the use of self-report measures in this population and in this context, however, tends to be heavily biased since drivers want to get their license back without having to undergo remedial programs. So it's important for us to identify ways to objectively identify drivers who are high risk and prevent that risk. Now, so we're faced with another problem as well. So even within this population of drivers with a first-time DWI offense, there's still a lot of heterogeneity. So for some people, the experience of getting their first DWI and facing the consequences of going through the judicial system is usually enough to deter those kinds of behaviors in future. For other people, however, they'll just get right back into their vehicle and do it again. So for this reason, in fact, most of the research has actually focused on recidivism. And it's been found that these drivers with repeated DWI offenses tend to have a specific phenotypic profile. So what it looks like is they would have blunted cortisol responses, lower platelet monoamine oxidase, greater impulsivity, sensation seeking, greater risk for other non-DWI offenses as well, which I'll get to in a moment, and greater depressed mood. And so for these drivers, I'll be referring to them a little bit as pure DWI drivers, because they're the ones who are committing these offenses over and over again. Then we also seem to have another type of driver as well. So there is a host of other risky driving behaviors that DWI offenders will be more likely to engage in, even when they're not intoxicated at that moment. And so these behaviors encompass the rest of what is considered risky driving. And these drivers, their characteristics are actually a bit different from the drivers who are just committing DWIs over and over. So these drivers, they also have the blunted cortisol responses, but they also have greater alcohol misuse, and then sensation seeking and sensitivity to reward as well. So since these drivers have a bit more of a mixed profile, I'll be referring to them as mixed. So why am I making this distinction? What's the relevance of these different classifications? So these data that I'm showing now were taken from a study that was conducted by one of my former lab mates, Nathan Moxley-Kelly, who's now a clinical psych doctoral student at University of Vermont. And for a bit of context, the interventions that are typically designed for this population are designed only with that first group, the pure DWI or PDWI in mind. And so a typical intervention that's used is called brief motivational interviewing, or BMI. And this is an example of an intervention that has been used in DWI offenders in order to prevent them from committing more DWIs in future. However, what we're finding with survival analysis is that in the 5 years following BMI, only 5.2% of the pure DWI offenders committed a future offense, but still there were 14.5% of mixed drivers that were still committing future offenses. So it looks as though the BMI was being effective in the group of pure DWI offenders, but not in the mixed group. So there is a need to still design different interventions potentially that could be tailored specifically for that mixed group. And so with most of the research having been done already in that pure DWI group, my research looks specifically at the mixed group. And so what I did was conducted an observational longitudinal cohort study. And so this looked at patterns of behavior, real world behavior over the course of 9 years. And so this is taken from a manuscript that is now just being finalized for submission. So, okay, let's talk about these DWI offenders with a mixed risky driving outcomes. So the research on them is actually still quite nascent, and so we still need to better identify the factors that contribute to their risk. So the rationale for this study was to provide a longitudinal examination of the contributions of non-clinical depressed mood and alcohol misuse severity on the risk for future driving convictions. And then by following the future trajectories of first-time offenders, the study informs the early prediction of drivers who may become repeat offenders up to 9 years after initial assessment. Now, there are two possible contributing factors when we're talking about risky driving outcomes in this population. And so the two variables that I chose to look at in this context were depressed mood and alcohol misuse. And so the reason for that is that males are a particularly high risk group in this context. And so compared to females, males are actually more likely to drink when they're in a depressed mood. And so alcohol is likely used as a coping strategy for those feelings of loss that are often associated with being in a depressed mood. And so harmful or hazardous alcohol use also clusters with some personality traits as well, like sensation seeking. And that creates a risk profile for engaging in more dangerous behaviors like risky driving. So this got me thinking, since so much of the research focuses on symptoms that are severe enough to receive clinical diagnoses, what about the drivers with levels of depressed mood and alcohol misuse that are subclinical? So when depressed mood and alcohol use and misuse are combined, could they result in even greater risky driving than either one of them alone when they are at subclinical levels? So the research question that I was looking at was, do subclinical levels of depressed mood and alcohol use and misuse significantly increase risky driving in male DWI offenders? So to answer these questions, I analyzed data from a longitudinal observational cohort study. And so this was a sub-study, and we recruited adult males with a first-time conviction of DWI within the past 2 years. So they completed self-report questionnaires, some of which assessed depressed mood, alcohol misuse, and sensation seeking. And individuals were excluded if their scores on any of these questionnaires actually met criteria for clinical diagnoses, because again, we were only really interested in subclinical levels for this particular study. So that was done at baseline, and then participants were invited back to the lab 3 years later to complete a self-report questionnaire assessing risky driving behaviors. And throughout the course of this 9 years, we were also pulling data from their provincial driving records in Quebec on the type and number of driving infractions that they were actually receiving during this time. So who are the participants that were recruited? They were 129 male DWI offenders. Most of them were in their 20s or 30s at the time of their baseline visit. They were predominantly white, had never been married, and had already received about 4 or 5 major driving convictions in their lifetime. And most of these were for various speeding violations or running a red light or stop sign. And as it often happens in longitudinal clinical research, there was a lot of attrition. So about 50% of the participants didn't show up for their visit at year 3. However, these data were missing completely at random. So I estimated the missing values using multiple imputation. And so as you can see here, I looked at depressed mood and alcohol misuse and looked at them as predictors, potential predictors of risky driving at year 3. And so that was done using hierarchical multiple regression. Then for my second hypothesis, I did similarly, but looking at an outcome variable of risky driving offenses at year 9. And I also looked at sensation seeking and how it could potentially moderate the effects of alcohol misuse as well in both of those contexts. Now for the results, so the overall model in the first analysis for hypothesis 1 significantly predicted 33.6% of the variance in risky driving at year 3. So alcohol misuse at baseline was a significant predictor of risky driving at year 3. Depressed mood, however, did not significantly predict risky driving. And sensation seeking was not a significant moderator either. Now for the second hypothesis, this model predicted 37.4% of the variance in risky driving offenses at year 9. And so neither alcohol misuse nor depressed mood emerged as significant predictors here. Then In terms of the contributions, so using the first model, I was able to predict risky driving 3 years in advance in a DWI sample. So this supports that DWI offenders may still pose an increased risk on the road, even when they're not acutely intoxicated by alcohol. So this is really interesting because normally when we think about alcohol and driving, we think about drivers who are currently intoxicated behind the wheel, but this is showing a risk of alcohol's effects on driving, even when drivers aren't intoxicated right at that moment. And then in terms of the contributions of the second hypothesis there, so we can look at the bigger picture in terms of the covariates that were used that helped to still predict risky driving 9 years later. So there were some demographic variables that were included there. And the fact that we're able to predict risky driving 9 years in advance with this model was also immensely powerful in terms of highlighting the long-term risk of this population on the road. And this is long after the immediate consequences and interventions associated with DWI have already worn off. And so a previous study that was done in this area has also found that alcohol misuse indirectly increased the odds of future traffic violations. However, my study helped to test that relationship directly. Then there's also some possible mediation happening by emotion regulation that might explain why I wasn't able to find the significant results for the effects of depressed mood on risky driving. So men in particular tend to have more maladaptive emotion regulation strategies, such as exhibiting externalizing behaviors like risky driving to cope with feelings of loss that they experience in a depressed mood. And so this is particularly true of men with high conformity to masculinity traits. Then there's also a possibility for greater sensation seeking, having a greater variability as well. So this could have affected the results as well. And then in terms of the future directions, there is a scale that looks at male depression risk in this specific context. So looking at the symptoms that might be more often seen in this population as opposed to the broader population. And then more representative research samples. So while the largest metropolitan areas in Canada, which are Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, account for 35% of Canada's population, actually only 8% of DWIs occur in these areas, suggesting a need for research on a broader spectrum of DWI offenders, particularly those in rural areas. And although data on the racial demographics of road traffic crashes are not available in Canada, we do know that in the US, Indigenous people are 3 times as likely to die from road traffic crashes. So that's particularly concerning given that a similarly high proportion of Canada's Indigenous peoples currently live rurally. So that's about 58.8% of them in Canada versus 54% in the US. And so the disproportionate impact of road traffic crashes on rural and Indigenous communities calls for some continued research to identify the factors contributing to road traffic crashes among DWI offenders in a rural context. Then another future direction is that DWI offenders may also have a higher propensity to engage in a greater diversity of risky behaviors. So things like risky sexual behavior or illicit substance use as well. So with all that said, how can implementing ML in this area help? So while there is preliminary support for these typologies of pure DWI and mixed group, they're still in relatively small sample sizes, and it would be important to determine whether these findings can be replicated in larger and more diverse samples. And of course, as I mentioned before, the demographic diversity and looking at rural geographies. So this was done mostly on people who were residing in the Montreal metropolitan area. And the study was only conducted on males and consisted mostly of white males. So there are already a lot to unpack there in terms of improving the demographic diversity. Then just a tip as well. So for any ML scientists who are wanting to work in with mental health or any health data, there's often a barrier since these data are typically collected for clinical research studies, and they're heavily protected by data privacy and other ethical regulations that Anna actually touched upon a lot of it in her presentation earlier. So I would also encourage you, if this is an area that you're really interested in getting involved in, to get creative. So think about the criminal justice databases. So this particular study, it was a combination of clinical data, but we also had data from the provincial database on their criminal convictions as well. So look into other areas where you might be able to obtain data that can still inform about health and mental health outcomes, even though they're not necessarily directly collecting that information. It can still be quite helpful and provide opportunities for application in other areas as well. And if interested in studying addiction or certain cognitive processes, another area to consider is also using gamified tasks to collect data. So my area is in neuropsychology, and there are plenty of computerized tasks that are used, and the data can be collected through those methods as well. So that's another potential area. So so coming back to my research question, I identified alcohol misuse as a significant predictor of risky driving 3 years later. And so these findings have implications for driver education and awareness, and for targeting interventions during the relicensing process. And that is all. Thank you so much. And